so welcome everybody to another episode of Bones and Stones. Today we've got Peter Morrissey with us, who's currently a WITS PhD student. Pete has been involved in a couple of geoarchaeological projects, starting from his honors through to his masters, and he's now doing some geoarchaeological work down along the Southern Cape Coast. So we thought we'd bring Pete on today to talk a little bit about the importance of geoarchaeology and site formation more generally. This is something which excites me a lot. I'm sure you can see the smile. And I'm sure you can see Tim's very bleak face. He tends to kind of glaze over when we start talking about these issues. Cara, Macaroni, you're not too bad because you're very much involved with these kinds of aspects of research as well. So so between I think the three of us, Tim unfortunately outnumbered today. So but we're looking forward to discuss a couple of aspects of your research and your project work and stuff. So Pete, let's maybe kick off with your kind of progression from undergrad into postgrad, and then where you started focusing on geoarchaeology research, and how you started off with your initial research in the Cradle.
First of all, hi guys, thanks very much for having me on. So I kind of had it was all very sudden, my decline into geoarchaeology. I was sort of in third year. There were just, so many things that were interesting in archaeology. I didn't have a specific handle on what I wanted to do. And then we had a guest lecture from Dominic Stratford, who you all know, who's one of the few fully qualified geoarchaeologists in the region. And it wasn't really something we'd been exposed to in undergrad in any real way. And it just it grabbed me. It just, to me, sounded like something that was really cool and made sense. And so I ended up taking an honors project with him, working at Marapeng, which is an open air early Stone Age site in the Cradle of Humankind. And it was, in many ways, it was quite a basic project, in terms of the methods. They were, fairly simple, but interesting.
Thanks, Pete. Just to touch on something you mentioned about, with dealing with geoarchaeology in undergrad, you said that it's not something that you were really exposed to. And I found that as well, having come through WITS, although always with archaeology, we are taught that context is important. Having done geography as an additional major and having looked at aspects of geomorphology, for example, in landscape formation, that was a completely separate aspect of study which came through with the geography, and I also managed to do geology in undergrad as well. So with those aspects being treated individually in undergrad, obviously when you get into your postgraduate studies, you then have the opportunity to kind of bring all of those aspects together. So that's really where there's a lot of value in GeoArch. But I'm just going to hand over to Tim. He's got a question for you, Pete.
Yeah, thanks. And Peter, it goes in line with what you were saying, what Matt's has been saying now as well. Jokes aside, we do rag each other all the time, and because staring at sand grains and rocks that are rolling down rivers. It's really so interesting. Wow. But anyway, obviously geoarchaeology is like super important, and that applies to multiple periods in time. All of these sites we engage with, it's really important to understand these contexts. So why do you think, at least, why isn't it taught more at university? Why? Because it was the same, as Matt says, none of us really engaged with it. So, why aren't we learning more about this if it's so vital to our understanding of these sites?
I wish I could give a sort of on the spot, perfect answer. I don't really know for sure. I think one of the major problems is, we don't really have many people who do it, who are based at South African institutions. So that's the one thing where there's, not really the expertise to teach it. Yeah. I think it's also, it's a relatively young subdiscipline within archaeology. And so that can also have an impact. And I think for some people, it's also just seen as not really being that important. That attitude's changing, thankfully, and hopefully we'll continue to do that. But I think it's kind of a mix of factors, really.
Okay. Yeah, it's a tough one because it is really vital to understanding what's happening at a site, and yet it's not something that we made very familiar of at universities.
Cool. Thanks, guys. Yeah, Kerry, you've got a question for Pete?
Yeah, Pete, just wondering if you might be able to touch upon some of the methods that you applied in your honors to understanding the sort of landscape out at Meroping, and what were, just sort of like the basic conclusions about the accumulation of that material through the sort of numerous excavations that you were involved in.
Okay, the sort of major thing I did was I went around and I dug a series of test pits, so sort of small excavations, covering quite a large area. The idea being to kind of sample across this landscape and try and see what was going on in terms of the geomorphology and the sediments, to see if there was a general pattern or if there were big differences or things like that. Then, in terms of once the test pits were dug, I did field descriptions of the sediment profiles, which is sort of your starting point in geoarchaeology. That's always an important source of data. And then, collecting samples of the sediment, which I took back to the lab, and I analyzed, to find out the size of the particles, the shape of the particles, things like that, all of which tell us a bit about the processes involved in forming the deposits and also potentially where material is coming from. I also, looked at other factors both in the field and in the lab, looking at the size and shape of the clasts, the sort of natural rocks, and also the stone tools that we were finding, and then kind of use that on a landscape scale to try and reconstruct patterns of where the natural material seems to be coming from, where the artifactual material seems to be coming from, trying to understand if there was a difference in that, if it was the same kind of thing, if there were spatial patterns and all of that. And really the main thing that we kind of found is that it seems that the landscape was being used sort of fairly broadly by the humans that were around at that point. And we have this sort of accumulation of this deposit where material is being moved by very gentle processes of kind of slope wash. We just you have a slight slope. It's not very steep. But as water moves along that, when it rains and that, it just slowly kind of moves things around. And so we found that, there's a kind of general direction of movement. And so we're finding a lot of stuff in different places, but it's not necessarily where it was, discarded by whoever had made it or used it. And we then have a kind of secondary process where all of the stuff has been eroded in a very specific way, where a lot of the fine material, the sand and the clay and everything, has been removed to a large degree, leaving behind the artifacts. And so then there's also a kind of a compression in terms of time. So we've got stuff that's been moved around across the landscape, but also being sort of pressed down into each other. So it means, obviously there are implications for the understandings we have of human behavior, both over time and space.
Thanks, Pete. That's really interesting. I mean, the Morrissey landscape is an interesting one. Kara, I've had the opportunity to work with Dominic Stratford doing the excavations and stuff, and that whole landscape is incredibly interesting. But if I could maybe just zoom out a little bit and talk about maybe some of the broader significance of GeoArch as an approach. At least the one thing that I've experienced, doing this kind of research is, geoarchaeologists are very much concerned with patterns. And the Morrissey site is a great example of that, where you have anthropogenically produced patterns, where you have hominids producing stone tools and dropping them on a landscape, presumably linked to raw material outcrops as well. And then you also have patterns which develop through non-anthropogenic processes, natural processes. So you mentioned things like surface wash and stuff, which would then deflate the landscape. And then the third pattern that the geoarchaeologists will have to deal with is assessing the relative contribution of each of those patterns, and then what that talks to in terms of the context of the assemblages. And that's always something that's quite tricky to work with. So Pete, maybe if we could talk a little bit about your master's work, and we could maybe touch on the aspect of combining multiple data sets, because that's always been something very interesting to me when it comes to geoarchaeology research, is we're trying to develop a picture of what the paleo environment would have been like at a specific point in time. And very often we have to use a range of different methods which operate at different scales. And we then have to combine those different methods in order to come up with a robust understanding, or at least a more holistic understanding of what the paleo environment looked like. So what did you kind of get involved with your master's research down in the Cape?
So my master's specifically was focused on a group of open air sites around East London that show human occupation of the kind of coastal zone in that area during a period between about 130,000 years ago and sort of 110 or so thousand years ago. And it's interesting because, during that period of time, really all the evidence we have for occupation of coastal zones is, more towards the Southern Cape and the Western Cape. So it's kind of an outlier. So it's interesting from that perspective. But what I was mainly working on was trying to understand the environment in which human activity was taking place. And so I did that, trekking around, looking at the geology, and trying to find how it's associated specifically to particular evidence for human occupation, which in this case includes a set of human footprints, which were made in a sand dune, which then was lithified and became a rock called aeolianite. And then we also have beach rock, which is essentially what it sounds. It's beach deposits that are lithified, and we've got stone tools in that as well as some estuarine deposits with stone tools. And so there are kind of a few different environments that seem to have been occupied within this coastal zone. So the kind of main things I was trying to do was, first of all, come up with a stratigraphic model. So I was working across about 3 or 4 kilometers of coastline, trying to work out how these different sites related to each other in terms of time. And it got very interesting in terms of what I was able to work out. So it was a period of relatively high sea level, and it looks like the kind of highest point reached was about 7 meters above the current level, which is obviously quite a significant change. And that's sort of bracketed by 2 periods of slightly lower sea level, lower than today. And it was interesting. We were also able to, through looking at these fossilized dune deposits, we were able to get an understanding of wind patterns and things like that, which is interesting because we didn't really have any data on what the wind conditions were like there. And they seem to be fairly similar today. And what's also exciting is it seems that we've now got the evidence where we can say that the rainfall seasonality was the same as it is now, which is interesting because we've got human occupation of largely winter rainfall zone down in the Southern Cape, and here we've got a summer rainfall zone with people occupying it. So it's interesting for the broader context of things.
No, that's really great. Just something you mentioned now about the wind directions. I know the site of Heelbeck in the Western Cape. I know that's something that Andrew Kendall and his colleagues published in 2004, looking at the movement of objects in relation to the dominant wind directions, which is quite interesting. And I wonder how those wind patterns would vary from what you were looking at in the Eastern Cape. But Tim, you've got a question?
Yeah, Peter, just sort of taking a step back again, like Matt had earlier. We've been asked to look at some assemblages and things like that have been collected from cultural resource management mitigation programs. And one of the things that that we've noticed often is sometimes these come from very modified or altered landscapes. And I wonder, kind of in the context of cultural resource management, having a good understanding of geoarchaeology might actually go a long way, because it would help in terms of assessing the significance of sites. I mean, I don't know if you agree, or I suppose it's more of a comment, but at least in my mind, that can go a long way in terms of understanding these landscapes and what needs to be mitigated and what shouldn't be, maybe.
I agree. The sort of application of geoarchaeology in heritage resource or cultural resource management is something that I've actually been thinking about for a bit, and that is an interesting perspective. The idea that having a geoarchaeologist assess the context of a site as a way of then saying, is this a site that we can, just sort of dig up and then develop in the area, or is it something that we need to, really focus on preserving? And I think it's something we need to start thinking about. And we have limited resources in SA. I mean, around the world, we don't have enough resources to dig every site properly, but it's particularly a problem in SA at the moment. So I think it would be a very useful thing. I also think, from my own experience working on sites that are, in the coastal zone, that are, currently dealing with coastal erosion and all of that, I think it's also a useful tool of working out what sites are at risk. So I think it would be great if we can then, bring in that double thing of working out if a site, should be preserved, if we should allocate those resources to it, but also working out how at risk a site is. And I think it would be a useful thing to start thinking about and applying.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Peter. I think we're going to call it there, coming up on time. Just to touch again on that point, Tim, I suppose it's a case of assessing the scientific potential of a site. And very often looking at an assemblage's or site's context is important in that regard. Yeah. If the context is very poor, then, the scientific value is just not going to be there. Anyways, but Pete, thanks very much. I really appreciate your time today to come through and talk a little bit about geoarchaeology and your research and stuff. And obviously, best of luck with your PhD research and stuff. I'm sure we can have you on again sometime soon to chat about some of the results.
Yeah, that would be awesome. Thank you very much for having me, guys.
Yeah, thanks for joining.
Thanks so much.